Why does she keep calling me that name? Nadine Holloway was standing at the kitchen counter of a diner she didn't own, wearing an apron that smelled like bacon grease and coffee grounds, when the old woman walked in for the third time that week and called her baby girl. The first time, Nadine had ignored it. Old people said things. The second time, she'd smiled politely and refilled the woman's cup. But the third time, the woman reached across the counter, touched Nadine's wrist, and whispered it like a prayer. "There you are, baby girl. I've been looking everywhere." Nadine pulled her hand back, not roughly, but fast enough to make the point. "Ma'am, I think you have me confused with someone else." The woman just smiled, sad and certain, like she knew something Nadine didn't. But we'll get to that. Nadine Holloway was 34 years old, a single mother raising a 9-year-old son named Quincy in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in East Baltimore. She worked the morning shift at Reba's Diner 6 days a week, picked Quincy up from aftercare at 4:15, helped him with homework at the kitchen table, and fell asleep most nights before 10 with her shoes still on. She had been doing this alone since Quincy was 3, when his father packed a bag on a Sunday morning and drove to Atlanta to figure some things out, and never figured his way back. Nadine didn't talk about it much, not because it didn't hurt, but because talking about it required energy she had already allocated to keeping the lights on. She had a system: wake up at 5, shower, braid her hair back, kiss Quincy's forehead while he slept, walk 11 blocks to the diner because the bus cost $1.90 each way, and $3.80 a day added up to a pair of sneakers Quincy needed by October. The system worked. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she was 17 and her guidance counselor told her she had the grades for a scholarship. But it was hers, and she had built it without asking anyone for anything, and that mattered to her more than she would ever say out loud. Quincy was the best part. He was tall for his age, skinny, with glasses that kept sliding down his nose, and a habit of asking questions that Nadine didn't always know how to answer. "Mom, why do some people have 2 grandmas and I don't have any? Mom, how come we never visit family on holidays? Mom, where did you live before here?" That last one was the hardest. Nadine had grown up in foster care. She entered the system at 4 days old and aged out at 18 with a garbage bag full of clothes, a GED, and a birth certificate that listed her mother as unknown. No father, no medical history, no forwarding address. Just a single item the hospital had logged alongside her intake, a silver locket, tarnished and small, with the letter N engraved on the front. Inside it, nothing. No photograph, no note, just a hollow space where something should have been. She had carried that locket her entire life. It lived in a zippered pocket inside her purse, and she checked for it the way other people check for their phone. Not because she believed it would lead her anywhere. She had stopped believing that around age 12, after the third foster mother told her, "Honey, if your mama wanted you, she would have come by now." But she kept it because it was the only proof that someone, somewhere, had once held her and bothered to leave something behind. So when the old woman at the diner called her baby girl for the third time that week, Nadine didn't think about it for long. She poured the coffee, wiped down the counter, and moved on. People projected. People imagined connections that weren't there. Nadine had learned to keep her distance from that kind of hoping. The old woman's name was Corinne Banks. She was 68, small and thin, with silver hair cut close to her head and hands that shook slightly when she lifted her cup. She dressed carefully, not expensively, but with attention, pressed slacks, a cardigan buttoned all the way up, low-heeled shoes that had been resoled more than once. She carried a leather handbag that looked like it had been nice 20 years ago, and she always sat in the same booth, the one by the window facing the street. She came in every Tuesday and Thursday, always alone. She ordered the same thing: 2 eggs over medium, wheat toast, black coffee. She ate slowly, watching the street like she was expecting someone, and she tipped well. Not extravagantly, but enough that Nadine noticed. Nobody at the diner knew much about her. Reba, the owner, said the woman had started coming in about a month ago and never caused any trouble. "She just sits there," Reba said, shrugging. Minds her business, leaves cash on the table. That's my favorite kind of customer. But Nadine had noticed something Reba hadn't. Corinne Banks watched her, not in a threatening way, not the way men sometimes watched her when she leaned across a table to clear plates. This was different. Corinne watched her the way someone watches a home movie, with recognition and ache, and a particular kind of attention that comes from seeing something you thought you'd lost. It made Nadine uncomfortable, not afraid, just unsettled, like standing in a room where the furniture has been rearranged while you were sleeping. Everything is technically fine, but something is off. On a rainy Thursday in October, Nadine was refilling the sugar dispensers when Corinne came in 20 minutes earlier than usual. She sat in her booth, but she didn't order. She just placed her handbag on the table, folded her hands, and waited. Nadine walked over with a menu and a coffee pot. Morning? The usual? Corinne shook her head. Not today. I just need to talk to you for a minute, if you can spare it. Nadine glanced at the mostly empty diner. 2 regulars at the counter. A man reading a newspaper in the back booth. Nobody needing anything. She set the coffee pot down and slid into the booth across from Corinne. What's on your mind? Corinne opened her handbag and took out a small envelope, yellowed at the edges and sealed with tape that had gone brittle with age. She set it on the table between them. Before I say anything, Corinne said, I want you to know that I don't expect anything from you. Not forgiveness, not kindness, nothing. I've been sitting in this diner for 5 weeks trying to find the right words, and I've decided there are no right words. So I'm just going to tell you the truth and let you do whatever you need to do with it. Nadine looked at the envelope. Something cold moved through her chest. Not quite fear. Something older than fear. What truth? She said. Corinne pressed her fingertips against the envelope. I was 18 years old when I had you. The sentence landed in the booth like something dropped from a great height. Nadine heard it, processed it, and immediately rejected it. Her body did what it always did when something threatened to breach the wall she had spent a lifetime building. She went still. Her face went neutral. Her hands flattened on the table. Excuse me? You were born on April 14th at Mercy General in Richmond, Corinne said, her voice steady but thin. You weighed 6 pounds, 2 ounces. You had a full head of hair and the strongest cry the nurse said she'd heard all week. I held you for 11 minutes. I counted. And then I handed you to a woman from social services. And I walked out of that hospital, and I have hated myself every day since. Nadine didn't move. She stared at Corinne with an expression that gave away nothing, because giving things away was a luxury she had never been able to afford. I left a locket with you, Corinne continued. Silver, with the letter N on the front. For Nadine, that's the name I gave you in my head. I don't know if they kept it or threw it away or I have it. The words came out before Nadine could stop them. Flat. Automatic. Like a reflex. Corinne's composure cracked. Her mouth trembled. She pressed her hand to it and closed her eyes, and for a moment she looked like a woman holding herself together with nothing but willpower and a cardigan buttoned all the way up. You have it, Corinne repeated. Barely a whisper. I have it, Nadine said again. Then she stood up, picked up the coffee pot, and walked back behind the counter. Her hands were shaking, but she poured a cup of coffee without spilling it, because she had been pouring coffee for 6 years, and her hands knew what to do even when the rest of her didn't. She didn't say another word to Corinne for the rest of the shift. Corinne sat in the booth for 2 hours, untouched envelope still on the table, and then left quietly. That night, after Quincy was asleep, Nadine sat on the edge of her bed and opened her purse. She took out the locket. She had looked at it 10,000 times, held it against her palm until the metal went warm, pressed her thumb into the engraved N like she could push through to whatever was on the other side. Now she knew what was on the other side. A 68-year-old woman in pressed slacks eating eggs over medium alone in a booth by the window. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, and every time she closed her eyes, she heard Corinne's voice saying, I counted. 11 minutes. Her mother had held her for 11 minutes and then let her go. Nadine tried to do the math on how many minutes she had spent waiting, in foster homes, in group homes, on birthdays when nobody came, in courtrooms where judges decided where she would sleep next. She stopped counting somewhere around 1 million. Corinne didn't come to the diner that Thursday or the following Tuesday. Nadine told herself she was relieved. She told herself the woman was confused or lying or delusional. She told herself a dozen stories that made the knot in her chest smaller. But she kept glancing at the empty booth by the window, and she kept reaching into her purse to touch the locket. On the second Thursday, Corinne came back. She looked thinner, older, somehow, than she had 2 weeks ago. She sat in her booth and ordered her usual, and she didn't look at Nadine. Not once. That was worse. The looking had been uncomfortable. The not looking was unbearable. Nadine finished her side work early. She poured 2 cups of coffee, carried them to the booth, and sat down across from Corinne without asking. "Tell me why," Nadine said. Corinne wrapped both hands around the cup. Her fingers were thin, the knuckles swollen with the kind of arthritis that comes from a life of working with your hands. "I was 18, Corinne said. "I grew up in a town called Granville, about 40 miles south of Richmond. Small place. Everyone knew everyone. My mother cleaned houses. My father drove a delivery truck until his back gave out, and then he didn't do much of anything except sit on the porch and resent the world." She took a breath. "Your father was a man named Curtis Webb. He was 20. He worked at the lumber yard outside town, and he was white." She paused, as if that single word still carried the weight it had carried 34 years ago. "My family was not the kind of family that accepted that. My father especially. When he found out I was pregnant, he didn't yell. He didn't hit me. He sat in his chair on the porch and said, 'You bring that child into this house and you are no longer my daughter.' And he meant it. What about Curtis? Curtis wanted to keep you." Corinne's voice broke slightly on the word. "He begged me to run away with him. He said we could go north, start over, get jobs, figure it out. He was 20 years old, and he believed that love could fix everything, and I wanted to believe him. Lord, I wanted to. But you didn't. I was 18. I had $40 in a savings account, and a mother who cried every night, and a father who told me I was dead to him. Curtis didn't have a car. He didn't have a plan. He had a job at a lumber yard that paid $6.50 an hour, and a rented room above a hardware store." She looked at the table. "I was terrified. And when I am terrified, I don't fight. I fold. That's the truth about me, and I have never once been able to forgive myself for it." Nadine listened. Her face was still neutral, but her jaw had tightened. The way it tightened whenever someone at the diner spoke to her like she was less than. "So I went to Richmond alone," Corinne continued. "I had you at Mercy General. I held you. And then I let them take you. I gave the hospital a locket because I couldn't afford anything else, and because I wanted you to know that someone had named you, that someone had thought about you long enough to pick a name and engrave it into metal." Nadine said, her own name, spoken like a foreign word. "Yes, because it means hope. And that was all I had left to give you." They sat in silence for a long time. The diner hummed around them. The coffee went cold. Outside, a bus stopped at the corner, let 3 people off, and pulled away. "What happened to Curtis?" Nadine asked. Corinne reached into her handbag and pulled out the sealed envelope. She placed it on the table between them again. "That's what's in here. Everything I know about him. His full name, his last known address as of 12 years ago, the name of the lumber yard, which closed in 2009, and a photograph." Nadine looked at the envelope. She didn't touch it. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come find me after 34 years? Corinne was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have a heart condition. The doctors call it cardiomyopathy. It means my heart is weak, and it's getting weaker, and eventually it will stop." She said it simply, the way people state facts when they have run out of ways to dress them up. "I've known for about a year. I spent the first 6 months pretending it wasn't happening. I spent the next 3 months finding you, and I have spent the last 5 weeks sitting in this diner, trying to find the courage to tell you the truth." She looked at Nadine directly. Her eyes were wet but steady. "I didn't come here to ask you to love me. I came here because you deserve to know where you came from, and because I didn't want to die being the only person who knew." Nadine stood up. She picked up both coffee cups. She walked back to the counter and set them in the dish bin, and then she stood with her back to the dining room and pressed both palms flat against the counter until the shaking stopped. Reba looked at her from across the kitchen window. "You good?" "Fine," Nadine said. "Just need a minute." She took the minute. She took 5, and then she went back to work. But she took the envelope home. She didn't open it right away. She put it in the drawer next to her bed, underneath a stack of Quincy's old report cards and a birthday card he had made her when he was 6 with the words, "Best Mom in the Whole World," written in orange crayon. She looked at the envelope every night for a week. It sat there radiating like something radioactive, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Quincy noticed everything. Kids do. Especially kids who have learned to read the weather of their mother's face to predict whether the day will be calm or stormy. "Mom, are you sad?" he asked one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a worksheet about fractions. "No, baby, just tired. You're always tired, but this is different tired." Nadine looked at her son, 9 years old, glasses sliding down his nose, a pencil behind his ear that he'd forget about until bath time. The most observant person she had ever met. "Someone told me something that surprised me," she said carefully, "and I'm still figuring out how I feel about it." Quincy thought about this. Good surprise or bad surprise? "I don't know yet. When you figure it out, will you tell me?" "Yeah, I'll tell you." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his fractions. 10 days after Corinne's confession, Nadine opened the envelope. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper with handwriting that was neat and deliberate, the writing of someone who had taken care with every word. Curtis Webb. Born March 3, 1972, in Granville, Virginia. Last known address as of 2014, 400 Tame, Birch Lane, Haverhill, Massachusetts. Former employer, Granville Lumber and Supply, closed 2009. And paper clipped to the bottom of the sheet, a photograph. Nadine held the photograph under the lamp on her bedside table. The man in the picture was young. Early 20s, white with sandy brown hair and a sunburn across his nose and forearms that said he worked outside. He was standing next to a pickup truck, squinting into the sun, half smiling like someone had told him to smile and he wasn't sure he wanted to. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up and work boots that were covered in sawdust. Nadine studied his face for a long time, his eyes, his chin, the slope of his nose. She had spent her whole life looking in mirrors and seeing features she couldn't trace to anyone. Now, for the first time, she could see where half of her face came from. She put the photograph on her bedside table, next to the locket. She lay in the dark and looked at them both. Two pieces of a life that had been disassembled 34 years ago, sitting side by side in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Baltimore. The next Tuesday, Nadine sat down in Corinne's booth before the woman even ordered. "I have questions." Corinne put down her menu. "Ask whatever you want. Did you ever look for me before now?" "Twice. Once when I was 30 and once when I was 45. Both times I hired someone. Both times they hit dead ends. Sealed records. No name on file. The system doesn't make it easy." She paused. "The third time, 8 months ago, I hired a woman who specializes in it. She found you in 6 weeks. I've known where you were since February. February, that's 8 months you knew where I was and didn't come. I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of exactly this. Of sitting across from you and seeing that you have every right to hate me." Nadine didn't say whether she hated her or not. She moved on. "Why Baltimore?" "I moved here 11 years ago, after my second husband died. He left me the house on Edmondson Avenue and a small pension. It's not much, but it's mine. Do you have other children? Corinne shook her head. No, I got married at 25. Howard, he was a good man. We tried for years. It never happened. The doctor said it was unlikely, some complication from the first pregnancy. She looked at her hands. So in a way, you were the only one. The only child I ever had, and the one I gave away. Nadine absorbed this. She asked more questions over the next several weeks. She came to Corinne's booth on Tuesdays and Thursdays during her break, 10 minutes at a time, methodically collecting facts like someone building a case file. She learned that Corinne had worked as a seamstress in Granville until she was 28, then moved to Norfolk, then to Baltimore. She learned that Corinne went to church every Sunday at Greater Hope Baptist on Pennsylvania Avenue. She learned that Corinne had high blood pressure, bad knees, and a cat named Otis who slept on her chest at night. She learned these things, and she cataloged them, and she kept a careful distance. She did not invite Corinne to her apartment. She did not introduce her to Quincy. She did not call her mom or mother or anything other than Mrs. Banks. And every time Corinne left the diner, Nadine watched her walk to the bus stop alone and felt something she refused to name pulling at the center of her chest. Then, on a cold morning in November, Quincy had a seizure. It happened at school. The nurse called Nadine at the diner. Nadine dropped a plate of pancakes on the floor, grabbed her jacket, and ran 6 blocks to the school in shoes meant for standing, not running. By the time she got there, the ambulance had already taken him to Johns Hopkins. At the hospital, a doctor explained that Quincy had a febrile seizure triggered by a fever they hadn't caught in time. He was stable. He would be fine. But they wanted to run some tests, and they wanted a family medical history. The clipboard stared up at Nadine with its neat rows of boxes. Heart disease, diabetes, epilepsy, cancer, stroke. Check yes or no. List affected family members. She checked unknown for every single box. Just as she had done at every doctor's appointment for 34 years. The nurse took the clipboard back, glanced at it, and said with no malice but no gentleness either, "Is there anyone you can contact? A parent or relative who might know?" Nadine sat in the plastic hospital chair next to Quincy's bed, holding her son's hand while he slept, and called Corinne Banks. Corinne arrived at the hospital in 40 minutes. She was wearing a coat over her nightgown because she hadn't taken the time to change. Her silver hair was uncovered. She was out of breath from walking from the bus stop, and she carried a plastic bag from a corner store with 2 bottles of water and a pack of peanut butter crackers. "I didn't know what to bring," she said, standing in the doorway of Quincy's room. "I don't need you to bring anything," Nadine said. "I need you to tell me if anyone in your family had epilepsy or seizures." Corinne sat down in the chair on the other side of the bed. She looked at Quincy. This was the first time she had seen him in person, and Nadine watched something pass across Corinne's face that was beyond language. The woman stared at the boy with an expression so full of love and grief and recognition that it seemed to age her and restore her at the same time. "My mother had seizures when she was young," Corinne said quietly, "grew out of them by her teens. And Howard, my late husband, no. But on my side, yes. My mother." Nadine wrote it down. "Anything else? Heart problems, diabetes, anything?" "My father had diabetes, type 2, and the heart condition I told you about, cardiomyopathy. The doctors say it can be hereditary." Nadine wrote that down too. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at Quincy, asleep with an IV in his arm and a hospital bracelet around his wrist that was too big for him. "Is he your grandson?" a nurse asked from the doorway, looking at Corinne. Corinne opened her mouth but didn't answer. She looked at Nadine. Nadine was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Yes, he's her grandson." Something shifted in the room. Nothing visible, nothing you could point to. But the air changed the way air changes when a window is opened in a house that has been sealed for a long time. Corinne stayed at the hospital all night. She didn't ask if she could. She just didn't leave. She sat in the chair beside Quincy's bed and dozed off and on. And when Quincy woke up at 3 a.m., confused and scared, it was Corinne who said, "It's all right, sweetheart. Your mama's right here. She just fell asleep. You're safe." Quincy looked at the old woman he had never met. "Who are you?" Corinne glanced at Nadine, who was awake now, watching from the other chair. "I'm—" Corinne started. "She's your grandmother," Nadine said. Her voice was rough from no sleep and too many hours of sitting in a hard chair, but it was clear. Quincy pushed his glasses up his nose. Even in a hospital bed, even at 3 in the morning, the kid was processing. "I didn't know I had a grandmother." "Neither did I," Nadine said. "Until recently." Quincy looked at Corinne again. He studied her the way he studied everything, with the careful, unhurried attention of a child who has learned that understanding things takes time. "Do you like fractions?" he asked. Corinne let out a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. "I can't say I've thought much about them lately." "I can teach you," Quincy said. "They're not that hard once you get the trick." "I would like that very much," Corinne said. Quincy was discharged the next afternoon. Nadine carried his backpack. Corinne carried the plastic bag with the crackers and water bottles. They walked to the bus stop together, the three of them, and stood waiting in the cold November air without speaking. It was the first time they had been outside the hospital together, and the daylight made everything feel more real and more fragile at the same time. On the bus, Quincy sat between them. He fell asleep with his head against Nadine's arm, and Nadine looked over his head at Corinne. "I'm not ready to forgive you," Nadine said quietly. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready." "I know. But Quincy needs family, real family, not just me running on empty 6 days a week. He needs to know where he comes from. He asks me about it all the time, and I never have answers. I'll tell him anything he wants to know. And I need to find Curtis." Nadine said it firmly. "Not a request, a statement. Quincy deserves to know both sides, not just your side, all of it." Corinne nodded. "The address I gave you is 12 years old, but I'll help you look, whatever it takes." Nadine looked out the bus window. The city moved past. Row houses and corner stores and churches and people bundled against the cold. "One more thing," Nadine said. "Anything. If you're going to be in his life, you show up. Every time. You don't disappear. You don't leave when it gets hard. Because I know what that feels like, and I will not let my son learn it." Corinne reached into the pocket of her coat and took out a small object. She held it in her open palm for Nadine to see. It was a locket, silver, tarnished, identical to the one Nadine had carried for 34 years, except this one had the letter C on the front. "I had 2 made at the same shop," Corinne said. "One for you, one for me. I've carried mine every day since the morning I left that hospital. It's the first thing I touch when I wake up, and the last thing I touch before I sleep. I have never once, in 34 years, stopped showing up for you in my mind. I know that doesn't count for much, but I will spend whatever time I have left making it count for more." Nadine looked at the locket in Corinne's palm. Then she opened her purse, took out her own locket, and held it up. 2 pieces of tarnished silver, 34 years apart, close enough to touch. She didn't put them together. Not yet, but she didn't put hers away either. Over the weeks that followed, things changed slowly and carefully, the way ice melts in early spring. Not all at once, not without setbacks, but steadily. Corinne came to dinner on Sundays. Nadine cooked. It was nothing fancy. Baked chicken, rice and beans, collard greens from a can because she didn't have time to cook them from scratch. Corinne ate everything and complimented everything and washed the dishes without being asked. Quincy took to Corinne the way children take to people who actually listen to them. He taught her fractions. She taught him how to sew a button back on a shirt. He showed her his collection of rocks from the schoolyard. She told him which ones were limestone and which ones were quartz, because she picked up a few things from a lifetime of paying attention to small things. At school, Quincy drew a family tree for a class project. For the first time in his life, he had more than one branch. He wrote Grandma Corinne on the left side and drew a question mark on the right side, where a grandfather's name would go. Then he showed it to Nadine and said, "I left space for when we find him." Nadine taped the drawing to the refrigerator and looked at it every morning while the coffee brewed. In January, 3 months after the hospital, Nadine and Corinne began searching for Curtis Webb. Corinne paid for the search service out of her pension. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The old address in Haverhill was a dead end. Curtis had moved, but the investigator followed a trail of utility records and DMV files north through New Hampshire and eventually to a small town in southern Maine called Keniston. Curtis Webb was 54 years old. He worked at a boatyard. He had never married. He lived alone in a rented cottage near the harbor. And according to the investigator's notes, he had a framed photograph on his kitchen shelf of a young black woman he had known in Virginia, a woman he'd never stopped asking about. Nadine read the investigator's report at the kitchen table while Quincy slept. She read it twice. Then she put her head in her hands and cried for the first time since Corinne had walked into the diner. Not because she was sad, because for 34 years she had believed that both her parents had thrown her away, and now she was learning that at least one of them had wanted to keep her. They drove to Maine on a Saturday in February. Nadine, Quincy, and Corinne in a rented car that smelled like air freshener and anxiety. Quincy sat in the back seat reading a book about marine biology because someone had told him Maine had tide pools. Corinne sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap, looking out the window with the expression of a woman driving toward the most terrifying conversation of her life. The boatyard was easy to find. Keniston was the kind of town where everything was easy to find because there were only about 12 things in it. A main street, a church, a general store, a harbor, and the boatyard, where 3 men were working on an overturned hull in the cold gray light. Nadine parked the car. She sat behind the wheel for a full minute, both hands gripping at 10 and 2, staring at the men by the boats. "Which one is he?" Quincy asked from the back seat, pressing his face to the window. Nadine didn't know. She had only seen a photograph from 34 years ago. She was looking for sandy brown hair and a sunburn, but the men were wearing coats and hats, and she couldn't tell anything from this distance. "Wait here," she told Quincy and Corinne. She walked across the gravel lot toward the boatyard. One of the men looked up. He was older, thick gray hair under a knit cap, weathered face, broad shoulders gone slightly soft with age. He wiped his hands on a rag and squinted at her. "Help you with something? I'm looking for Curtis Webb." The man tilted his head, the same way Nadine tilted her head when she was thinking, the exact same angle. "That's me," he said. Nadine stood in the cold February air, 6 feet from the man who had wanted to keep her, and for the first time in her life, she didn't know what to say. She, who had an answer for every rude customer, a comeback for every late landlord, a solution for every broken thing in her apartment, stood there with her mouth open and nothing coming out. Curtis looked at her, really looked, and something moved across his face, slow and enormous, like a weather system you can see crossing a plain. "You're Corinne's girl," he said. "Not a question. How do you know that?" "Because you look just like her, and because I've been waiting for someone to show up and tell me what happened for 34 years. His voice cracked on the number. Are you the baby?" "I'm the baby," Nadine said. Curtis Webb set down the rag. He put both hands on the edge of the overturned hull and leaned on it, and he breathed the way a man breathes when the world has just rearranged itself around him, and he needs a moment to find his feet. "She told me she lost you," he whispered. "She called me from the hospital and said there were complications and that we'd lost the baby. I believed her. I had no reason not to. I mourned you. I mourned you for years." He looked up. His eyes were red. "You were alive this whole time." "I was alive," Nadine said, "and I was looking for you." Behind her, a car door opened. Quincy climbed out, unable to wait any longer because patience was not his strongest quality, and walked across the gravel with his book about marine biology under one arm. "Mom, is that him?" Curtis looked at the boy. Glasses. Skinny. That head tilt. "Is that your son?" "This is Quincy. He's 9. He wants to see the tide pools." Curtis Webb looked at his daughter, then at his grandson. Then he pressed his fist against his mouth and turned away, because there are some moments a person needs to have privately, even in the middle of a boatyard in Maine in February. Quincy walked up to him without hesitation, the way children walk toward things that scare adults, and said, "Hi, I'm Quincy. Are you my grandfather?" Curtis knelt down in the gravel. He was eye level with the boy now. He nodded because he couldn't speak. "Cool," Quincy said. "Do you know anything about tide pools? My book says there might be sea urchins." Curtis laughed. It came out broken and wet, but it was a laugh. "Yeah, buddy, I know a few things about tide pools." That afternoon, 3 generations stood on the rocky shore of Keniston, Maine, looking into a tide pool. Curtis pointed out sea stars and periwinkles. Quincy took notes in a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket. Nadine stood slightly apart, watching them, the locket in her fist. Corinne had stayed in the car. She hadn't been ready to face Curtis. Not yet. That conversation would come later, harder and heavier, loaded with 34 years of a lie that had cost everyone at this shore something they could never fully get back. But it would come. Nadine would make sure of that. Because she had made a decision somewhere between Baltimore and Maine, somewhere on that long highway with her son reading in the back seat and her mother sitting in silence beside her, she had decided that the cycle of secrets and silence and people folding when they were afraid stopped with her. It stopped now. Not because she had forgiven anyone. She hadn't. Not Corinne for leaving, not Curtis for believing the lie without pushing harder, not the system for losing her inside it for 18 years. But forgiveness and family, she was learning, don't always arrive at the same time. Sometimes one shows up years before the other, and you build what you can with what you have. That evening, in the parking lot of a diner in Keniston, that was nothing like Reba's but still smelled the same, Nadine took both lockets out of her purse. Hers and Corinne's. She opened them both. 2 hollow silver hearts with nothing inside. She handed them to Quincy. "Hold these for a second." She took out her phone and crouched down next to Curtis. Corinne stood to the side, uncertain, until Nadine looked at her and said, "Get in here, Ms. Banks." Corinne stepped forward. Nadine held the phone up. 4 faces in the frame. No one smiled. It wasn't that kind of photograph. It was the kind of photograph that says, "We are here, we exist, we found each other." Later, Nadine would print that photo small enough to fit inside a locket. 2 copies, 1 for each half. But for now, she just put the lockets back in her purse, took her son's hand, and walked into the diner to get something to eat. Because they had a long drive home, and Quincy needed dinner, and the work of becoming a family had only just begun. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the people in your life who deserve the truth, or the ones still carrying secrets that weigh more than they can hold, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, so you never miss a story. We'd love to know what you think. Should Nadine fully forgive Corinne? And what about Curtis, who spent 34 years grieving a child who was alive? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters here. And until next time, take care of each other.